Yeah, so you've asked how an ordinary person might think about Vidyasagar, known so popularly as a social reformer, as an educator, and these are certainly key aspects of his identity and of his career. But I think, in some level they remain kind of abstract and maybe don't connect to where people are in their daily lives. Social reform, it seems to be a very quintessential 19th century phenomenon where people were opposed to child marriage, or people were opposed to drinking, so they started societies to either abolish the consumption of alcohol, or they began to advocate for the remarriage of widows, as Vidyasagar did. These campaigns like that we don't think of in quite the same way anymore, and so social reformer may not be a rubric people are familiar with, but we can understand him as an educationist, certainly, and a big part of his career was vernacular education, using the Bangla language to help reach ordinary people, men and women, boys and girls, to help them imbibe what I think he thought was true, efficient, and valuable knowledge that could be used to build lives and livelihoods. And I think that's something everyone can resonate with, and this is where his school books come in. And of course, as soon as you mention his school books, you have to think of him, and I think people today are very interested in entrepreneurial spirits, people who can create new initiatives, innovators, if you will. And I think Vidyasagar absolutely fits the model of what we think of as an entrepreneur and an innovator. He innovated developments in the printing press and in publishing. He was immensely successful as a publisher and a printer himself, so that he earned a great deal of his subsequent livelihood by identifying the kinds of books that would be useful in the colonial educational context, finding ways to write them, print them, distribute them, sell them. Really quite remarkable for a man whose other identity, it's important to remember, is as a Sanskrit pundit. So someone from a family with a generations-long history as Brahmins, schooled in Sanskrit, knowledgeable in the Shastras, trained in subjects that many people today would be very arcane, and yet he took that kind of we could call traditional learning and sort of applied it to the context in which he was living, in which he also was studiously engaged in understanding Western learning English, thinking about new developments in science, and so coming up with new Bengali language and terms to speak about telescopes and the globe and all sorts of things that could, for him, help communicate to ordinary readers the new kinds of knowledge that was reshaping the world. Really remarkable for someone that, if we think of pundits often as dyed-in-the-wool, stubborn traditionalists who resist change, and of course he belies that stereotype. So another level on which we can appreciate him is just his humanity as a very simple man coming from a village background in Birsingho, in rural Bengal, making his way to the city with his father at a young age, virtually impoverished in the city in his early career, and both of them figuring out how to survive, and in his case going on to Sanskrit college, learning Sanskrit, gaining employment under the British, and having the success I mentioned, but all this while retaining this kind of connection to ordinary people. I think the stories about him, his, being mistaken for a gardener or being mistaken on a platform for a coolie, some of that had to do, I think, with his own desire not to stand apart, not to look like a Raja or act like some kind of prince, but to be an ordinary Bengali amongst Bengalis. And I have to believe that's one of the reasons he still lives on in popular memory and in stories and folk tales and all that, because people connect to this man. A lively sense of humor, sarcasm, irony. These are the things people think make us human, I think. So he doesn't stand apart in that regard. Yeah, I think today, in a context in which, believe it or not, 200 years since the man was born now, and we still struggle with something as fundamental as gender equity, which you would think after 200 years of reform and social engagement, civil rights movements, we would have made more progress than we have. Well, that's more than we can take on here, but certainly, even if it's been pointed out that perhaps some of his thinking about how to improve the lot of Hindu widows was limited or constrained by factors of his own Brahmanical inheritance or his colonial context or his inability to see some of the sort of conditions of the colonial economy. There are these sophisticated academic arguments about what might not have succeeded with his reforms. The thing that struck me in my book when I was talking about the stuff of legends and I was thinking about, in particular, the widow marriage movement, was this idea of recognition that it struck me when I read his translation of Shakuntala and when I read the Vidova Vivaho. Both of them, in some sense, are dealing with women who have been they've been fallen out of view in some sense, that the male actors have failed to recognize them as human beings. And so Dushanta fails to recognize the woman he has married and is bearing his child. And it's tragic, and I think in some sense we have to appreciate this is why Vidyasagar loved this story. It's heartbreaking, it's heart-rendering, this inability to see Shakuntala. And it struck me that this is what he's doing in Vidova Vivaho. He's asking Bengalis to wake up and look at the plight of the widow who is largely not recognized by society. She's ostracized, she's set apart, and she's considered somehow inauspicious, and she should just simply sit in the corner of the room and fast, and that's all we have to attend to. And I think he's basically saying, we need to look at these women and accept that they're fellow human beings, and then ask ourselves, what is our responsibility to them? So that I ended up writing a separate essay called The Shakuntala Paradigm, where I tried to identify that theme as a fundamental part of his moral project, that his moral mission was to get Bengali society to look at the problem of, we could call it today, gender inequity, and begin dealing with it. Again, he could not single-handedly transform things. He did not fully succeed in his social reform efforts in that regard, but certainly the model he set and the achievements he made bear our recognition in their own right. So the question would be, if we look to a figure like Gandhiji, we tend to isolate certain thematics that are characteristic of the man's moral and political mission, and obviously ahimsa, satyagraha, these are things that we intimately associate with Gandhi and with his methods for addressing social change, political change, the ultimate defeat of colonial rule, if you will. So if we were to look at Vidyasagar, what would we see? What would we identify as the kind of characteristic traits? And I think reason and this kind of attentiveness to the rational, historical, critical inquiry about the world around us, that is, not to receive truths in whole cloth and without investigating them. In a sense, a little bit like the Buddha in some sense. Don't receive things just on testimony from others, but look into them yourself, investigate them. And I think this is why he had the courage at the Sanskrit College to say, we maybe don't even need to teach certain philosophical doctrines anymore, like Sankhya or whatever, because they don't stand up to the test of modern science. So I'm prepared, as even a Brahmin pundit, to say we can set those aside. Let's embrace a modern scientific attitude, a research-oriented attitude, if you will, and make that the basis for a kind of new way of establishing our own dignity and integrity as people. The other defining probably characteristic of Vidyasagar would be his sense of humor. Rashasagar and Vidyasagar, right? I mean, the man who is just an ocean of humor. And again, this is one of those points I think that makes him so enduringly popular with the Bengali heart in some ways. It's the ability to poke fun at himself, but also at pretensions of other people. I think because of his basic humility, it seems to be, he had a real impatience with others' pretensions to elitism, authority, power, and of course he also had that moral compass that would not tolerate the kind of disrespect he received so famously in that incident with the principal of the Hindu college, when he pays him a visit and the principal has his feet on his desk and greets Vidyasagar without asking him to sit down, with his feet on his desk, and Vidyasagar is insulted and leaves and goes back to his office. He has, after all, a principal of the cognate college immediately adjacent under the same British rule. And so when Carr comes to visit him, he purposely puts his feet on his desk and greets Carr that way. And of course, Carr's, the principal of the Hindu college, is outraged and complains to the commissioner of education that this is an outrageous man, needs to be punished, and I deserve an apology. Well, of course, Vidyasagar turned the whole thing into a lesson in colonial rule in some sense, because he could very cleverly say, well, I learned my manners from the principal of the Hindu college. I thought that was good British custom to greet your guests with your feet on your desk. So, get that kind of humor, but humor with a moral edge is really, I think, a really distinctive feature, and not dissimilar to Gandhi, I think, who had a similar ability to poke pretense and to use a kind of that glint in his eye and that humor to take down the pretense of the British. Well, so how Vidyasagar could be a model today, particularly in a world in which we see the politicization of religion and the sort of propagation of what we're now already getting comfortable calling fake news in this world of alternative truths and all of this. I think Vidyasagar is a great person to look to return people to some sort of grounding in the notion that there is something called truth. There is the need for rational inquiry and investigation. There is this element I've already mentioned about his humanism, this kind of fundamental care for human beings, apart from what their caste status, religious identity, nationality, ethnicity might be. Again, speaking about the humanity of the man, this is a Brahmin pundit who we could say could have stood on his authority and his sense of superiority, but by most accounts doesn't seem to have done that. And of course, in the final phase of his career, moved out into what's now Jharkhand and Karmatar and lived with the Santhali people, who, by all accounts, he became very friendly with and treated on an equal basis, opening a homeopathic dispensary and providing medicines for people who were in need, and not standing on formality or superiority, but trying to connect at a level of doing good things for people, right? And when I first wrote my dissertation, one of the themes that struck me about Vidyasagar is this notion of effort, that one makes effort to improve, and one makes effort to improve oneself, right? So there's a kind of jatno, I guess you could call it, but it's also an effort that's imbued with care. It's care, so one's careful in what one does, so one does one's work well. And if you think about, again, his publishing and his editing, and the work he did was always meticulously done. He was not hasty, he was not sloppy, but at the same time, his work is always imbued with care for others, it seems to me. But care not framed as a religious mission or a political project. He seems to have been, I think many people think of him as a secularist, and many people even think maybe an atheist or an agnostic, that being Hindu to him didn't seem to matter in any level, that he wanted to make that a mission, that I want to make people Hindu, or I want to, right? He would engage with Muslims, he would engage with tribal people, would engage with upper caste, low caste, wherever he found need, the suffering widow or the famine victims, malaria victims. He seems to have been willing to go there and provide what help he could. So if we can't learn from someone like that, then maybe we can't learn. So one of the most popular stories with respect to Vidyasagar is about the young boy Ishwar Chandra, who had not yet become Vidyasagar, going from his village home in Birsingho to the city of Kolkata, where his father had begun working at very modest wages, but had the hopes of bringing Ishwar Chandra to the city to get him educated. And of course, this is a story that's just rich with the sense of promise, because here's the young boy going to go from rural obscurity into the big metropolis, and as we know, because we know his story, he's going to become the great man. And the story, as it's told, is that along the way, walking, and so is already, we can have a sense for the hardiness of the family and the young boy who made this trip. Walking along the way, and as they approach Kolkata, Vidyasagar notices these stones implanted along the side of the road, and he asks his father, Are these grindstones? Because he's thinking of the stone that would be used in the kitchen to grind the spices. And it's a natural thing for the child to ask. He doesn't know what these are. Why would they be stuck in the dirt along the side of the road? And his father says, no, this is something the English have planted here. These are called milestones, and they record the distance to the city registered in English miles. And the young boy, you can see him processing that in his mind and thinking, okay, and setting about. He says, well, I'll learn the English numbers then. And so his father has pointed out that each stone has a number on it. So the boy, all of the age of 8, as they're walking along, passing each number, he's thinking that's 11, this must be 10, that means that's a 9, that'll be an 8, and a 7. And so at some point he can tell his father, Takuras, Baba, I figured out the numbers. I know what the English numeral system is. And of course, the father takes this, and the biographers build on this and say, this is the sign of this young boy's promise, that he has such an acute and agile mind that on his own he worked out the English numerals. So that milestone story, milestone or katha, if you will, becomes a hugely important sort of crystallization of not just Vidyasagar's story, but I think it's a story about possibility for anyone who wants to apply themselves to tackling a problem. So you put your mind to it, you engage with it, you use your reason, and you figure it out. And it's supposed to be a story of promise, I think, and hope. And so maybe we can use that as a story to think about what elements of Vidyasagar could be activated in any of our lives. So it is the 200th birth anniversary year, and I was privileged to go to Kolkata and give the keynote address at the Asiatic Society for their 2-day seminar on Vidyasagar. And every time I go back to Kolkata, I'm always looking to see how the city has changed. After all, I've been going there since 1986 and have seen immense changes. And sometimes it seems as the space of 6 months brings radical changes just in the loss of traditional architecture, the tearing down of old homes, the building of new kinds of supermarkets, all this kind of thing we know. But you're looking for subtler things about the way Vidyasagar lives on. And of course, just a few months earlier, we'd had this destruction of the bust at Vidyasagar College on Vidhan Shorani. And I had written a piece for Scroll.in about how sad it is that Vidyasagar always seems to be in the middle of conflict, and yet people often don't even understand the man with any level of complexity. And I think the incident, the destruction of the bust, is just a sad political fracas gone awry in which a bust was destroyed with no particular intent. I think it's different than the beheading of the Vidyasagar statue in College Square, which happened during the Naxal period, and there was real political intent to send a message to comprador Bengalis who had supposedly, collaborated with British rule. Here it was just simple, we could just say ignorance. And so it does make you think, what needs to be remembered and what is remembered about the man? Now, to me, the most uplifting and inspiring and hopeful thing about the seminar was that the crowds were quite good for the lectures there, for the sessions. And I was really quite amazed the number of young students, men and women, who came to greet me afterwards carrying copies of my book, and knew if they didn't have the book, they knew about the book, they knew about my work. And I took it less about my significance than that they were thinking about Vidyasagar, that they had been led to ponder what is the significance of this man here in the 21st century, who by all rights ought to seem about as alien to us as anyone could, because he comes from a time that's so very different. But so I took from that a great sense of hopefulness, and I think when I travel around the city and just meet shopkeepers or ride in a taxi cab, you only have to mention Vidyasagar's name, and I still believe almost everyone, if they're a Bengali, they will have a story to tell. They'll say, oh, I remember that man. Now the stories will get mixed up with other stories, and they probably aren't always historically accurate, we could say, but they have some place in the Bengali imagination or the Bengali heart about what it means to be. I think it often comes down to a kind of sense of integrity, hard work, courage, and confidence toward improvement of one's life. And so Geetika Trust has a kind of project to promote social harmony and to help people lift themselves out of circumstances and provide new opportunities for themselves. I can't think of a better sort of model or paradigm of a human being to advance than someone like Vidyasagar, coming from those remote, rural, impoverished origins and becoming such a figure of, immense importance for the shaping of who Bengalis would become in the modern period.
So a little bit about me first. Hello, I'm Sabeena Mathayas and I'm the Education Specialist for the National Skill Development Corporation, a public-private partnership under the Skill India mission enabling short-term skill acquisition for underserved youth in India. I specialize in education policy and administration, having previously worked on programs and interventions ranging from charter school governance and after-school community engagement to immigration reform. My research focuses on gender issues in education, the history of education in India, and the future of work and learning. It was during my doctoral research on India's history of education initiatives that I first dove into the work of Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay. As an educator, his legacy was the expansion of access to learning across caste and gender lines. But he is remembered most for his eloquent advocacy for widow remarriage. It may not seem like much today, but it was vital that an individual of his stature and background was a vocal ally. He bridged the religious-cultural divide with an argument for choice. His pamphlets had a unifying appeal in their invocation of Yuga Dharma, exactly what the times demanded. He enabled widowed women who were ostracized pariahs, essentially outside society, to gain a degree of choice, while remaining within society. To have a choice and still belong. We may be far from that even now. India's complex sociocultural mores continue to see to that. But we have come a long way since 1856. It was only in 1954 that interreligious marriages and divorces were even allowed, and in 1956, when Hindu daughters were given equal rights to an inheritance. But Vidyasagar pushed that first domino with an articulate, pioneering inclusivity. And that legacy continues to underline social conceptions and policy debates about women's access and agency in India. The road since that first domino has been inconspicuously tumultuous, but not without important victories. Women, after all, presented the Union of India with her flag, the Tiranga, at that historic stroke of the midnight hour in 1947. One wonders what a contemporized Vidyasagar would say about the long road that females in India have crawled to gain a modicum of access, agency, and parity with their Indian male counterparts. We have come from Zenana education in the 1800s, which was learning and instruction given at home for girls, to the current nationwide shift to digital and online learning at home in the midst of a global pandemic. We are grappling with the same issues, the conflicts with domestic and care work, the effectiveness and constraints of at-home learning, and the cost of ensuring equal access and learning outcomes. The gender dimensions of school closures are only emerging. According to estimates from UNESCO India, of the 320 million children enrolled in pre-primary to tertiary levels of education, about 158 million are female students. Schools in India are the only source of meals, safety, sanitation, and health services for girls, especially from low-income rural households. With girls spending more time at home, they face the burden of unpaid domestic and caregiving work, along with increased vulnerability to gender-based seclusion and violence. Even before the pandemic, the McKinsey Global Institute reported that girls who engage in even 2 hours of housework per day had a lesser probability of finishing secondary school. We now face the risk of increased female dropouts and reversing the gains in recent years. But what gains are we referring to? According to the 2018-2019 round of the Periodic Labour Force Survey, or the PLFS, the female labour force participation rate in India is at a historic low, 17.6%. The World Bank places it a tad higher, 20.5% as of 2020. In fact, female labour force participation has been falling steadily since 2005, where it peaked at 31.5%. In a strange reversal of global trends, with increasing female education came decreasing female employment. In fact, the higher the level of educational attainment, the lower the probability of employment. Only 14% of the urban women were employed compared to 19% of rural women in India in 2019. Employment among rural women seems acceptable only in the face of dire circumstances. As household, read male, incomes increase, they too opt out of the workforce to focus on unpaid domestic and care work. Some of this has to do with the lack of safety for Indian women. But this lack of safety is a result of the patriarchal practices and norms that strictly circumscribe masculine and feminine identities, masculine and feminine activities, masculine and feminine spaces, and masculine and feminine agency. Men live public, political, economic lives, and women are the home, private, out of sight. Their visibility is a trespass, except as an exception. As trite as it sounds, it is a mindset problem, and it could not have happened at a worse time. Since 2018, India's working age population, that is between the ages of 15 and 64, has grown larger than its dependent population. It is predicted that this bulge in working age population will last till 2055. The growth potential that results from shifts in a population's age structure is called a demographic dividend. Other Asian economies like Japan, China, and South Korea were able to use it to fuel growth and innovation. India is currently the largest individual contributor to the global demographic transition. Over the next 2 decades, the continuing demographic dividend in India could add about 2 percentage points per annum to India's per capita GDP growth. However, this is only possible if the working age population is actually working. Youth labor force participation is at 27%, though this could be attributed to spending more time acquiring formal educational qualifications. But that would not explain the labor force participation rate of the Indian working age population at large, which stands at its lowest historically at 49.8%. And unemployment is compounded if one is a member of a minority group, like a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. Among other issues, employers find a critical skill gap, both technical and behavioral, in the workforce at large. This bears to question the relevance of current formal educational qualifications to find decent, dignified work, irrespective of gender. My work through the Skill India mission and its complementary initiatives is to bridge the gap between learning and earning. We've done that in a couple of ways. Over the 10 years of its existence, NSDC and its industry partners have created India's first descriptive repository of activities. Not jobs, not degrees or qualifications, but formal and informal activities that lead to a wage, to livelihood. These activities become occupational standards, industry-defined and ratified competencies. These are then used to develop short-term, continuous technical, vocational and professional training programs linked to employment. Despite lean resources, we saw some success. Women enrolled in TVET programs, and even gender split in classrooms, even outperforming men in all technical assessments. Women were still being directed to more caregiving, human-centric roles like beauticians, service staff, and tailors. But they also chose training programs in IT, finance, water management, and retail services. And yet, they did not feature as actively in the employment numbers. We figured it's because of the changing world of work. Industry 4.0, automation, disruption, big data, all that fun newspeak. The World Economic Forum declared in 2018 that everyone will need 101 days of additional learning by 2022 because of the technological revolution. But what should the focus be? More technological competencies? The youth today is Generation Alpha, the first generation to grow up entirely in the 21st century, who will never remember a time before smartphones or smart assistants, denoting a sort of reboot of society in a fully realized digital age. India is leading the charge with this generation and its over 762 million internet users. But between unemployment, gender inequality, and addictively numbing tsunamis of digital content, what can we do to equip our future with the resilience and ability to bring value to learning, work, and society? Well, study after study expounded the need for skills that balance analytical reasoning with social and emotional intelligence. So basically, study after study told us we needed to fix our collective mindset. This could not be a top down approach. My work took me on a journey of embedding the occupational competencies defined with employers with gender consciousness and values for sustainability, inclusivity, and community. But to do that, I had to define what gender consciousness would look like, who would model it, and of course, where it could happen. My focus was a gender and sustainability consciousness in the world of work. I built the tools. My team and I searched for similar organizations, building awareness, facilitating change, teaching allyship. It is slow progress, but we built a network of allies and we're still going. Women account for 7% of the world's leaders and 24% of its politicians. In India, only 8.32% of seats in state legislative assemblies are held by women. The wage gap in India is 35%, which means a woman only makes 65 rupees for every 100 rupees earned by a man. A rape is reported in India every 15 minutes. Between the economic boom of the 1990s in the North and the skill development mission, the range of vocations and professions open to women has broadened, but the world of work and politics remains fundamentally masculine. While some gender mainstreaming work has brought the vocabulary of gender and sustainability training inside the offices, the hallways, and into the language of employers and industry leaders, India is a vast, voluptuously diverse country. It takes a lot more than a couple of frameworks for a culture to evolve. And yet somehow, Vidyasagar pushed the needle over 200 years ago. Because of him and the legions of women and men that followed in his footsteps, we now have the tools and ability to push the needle a little bit farther.
I am happy to participate in the documentary film on Vidyasagar, which has been being made by Gitika Trust. I started my education with Barna Porichoy by Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay, and I thought that this is the best way I can pay my tribute to Vidyasagar and also contribute to Vidyasagar studies. The topic is Contemporizing Vidyasagar, Vidyasagar's reform movement in 19th century Bengal and their contemporary relevance. Vidyasagar used his social and political connections with the colonial rulers to spearhead a series of reform movements. Vidyasagar was born as Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay. He was born on September 26, 1820. He was born in village Bishinga district, Mednipur, Bengal Presidency. To show the contemporary relevance of Vidyasagar's reforms is our major objective. We will discuss Vidyasagar's reforms in two parts. Part 1, educational reforms and reform of the Bengali language. Part 2, social reforms. This work, drawn on my previously published work, was Vidyasagar a failure as a social reformer? It is supplemented by other books, research papers, and various websites. In a letter to the Council of Education dated 7th September 1853, Vidyasagar wrote, "What we require is to extend the benefit of education to the masses of the people." As part of his educational reforms, Vidyasagar wrote a Bengali primer in two parts in 1851. It was titled Barna Porichoy. Part 1 of Barna Porichoy introduces the child to the world of Bengali letters, word and sentence formation. This is Barna Porichoy, and the part 1, as I mentioned, deals with the alphabet and simple words and sentences, and part 2 is a reader. I'll just read out a part of part 2. Here, not only do children read simple sentences, but also they get their first moral lessons. I read, কখনো কাহাকে কুবাক্য বলিও না, কুবাক্য বলা বড় দোষ, যে কুবাক্য বলে কেহ তাহাকে দেখিতে পারে না. So the first lesson is never speak uncouth words. These primers are still used to introduce the Bengali child to the world of letters. Through Borno Porichoy, Vidyasagar fulfilled his vow of educating people through their mother tongue. Apart from Borno Porichoy, Vidyasagar wrote several Bengali books. These included Bakaron Koumudi. It was the first Bengali grammar. Vidyasagar was thus the father of the Bengali grammar. Kathamala, based on Aesop's fables. Betal Panchavinshati, a storybook translated from Betal Pachisi in Hindi. Chorita Boli. Vidyasagar was known as the father of modern Bengali prose. We find that Vidyasagar developed a lucid style of writing, established correlation between subject, verb, and object, discovered the relation between breath pause and meaning pause, and introduced punctuation marks accordingly. Vidyasagar's educational reforms started with his stewardship of Sanskrit College. Vidyasagar was appointed principal on 18th January 1851. So this is the photograph of the building of Sanskrit College. Now, how did Vidyasagar reform Sanskrit College? Firstly, let's see how Vidyasagar found Sanskrit College. He found, firstly, that teachers were not punctual in coming to class. Vidyasagar restored punctuality in teacher attendance. Secondly, students were disciplined by severe corporal punishments. Vidyasagar stopped the practice of corporal punishments. Thirdly, boys from only three castes, namely Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Vaidya, were entitled to study in Sanskrit college. Boys from lower castes were not allowed in the college. In a letter to the government, Vidyasagar protested against the caste-based discrimination practiced while admitting students to Sanskrit college. With the consent of the government, Vidyasagar opened the doors of the college to boys from all castes. He founded 35 girls' schools between 1857 and 1858. They included the Metropolitan Institution. He was directly involved in setting up the Calcutta Female School in 1849. This school is now known as Bethune School, which was opened by Vidyasagar. Vidyasagar also contributed to higher education. To enable poor and meritorious students to pursue higher learning, Vidyasagar opened a college, the Calcutta Metropolitan Institution, in 1872. This is the Vidyasagar College. The government of India refused to give financial support for his plans. Vidyasagar's conflict with the Director of Public Instruction over the issue of opening model girls' schools led to his resignation in 1858. Vidyasagar. Failure to get the Director of Public Instruction approve of his plans for model girls' schools was on the surface a failure. But due to his campaign for female education, girls can now go to school. Later in the film, Dr. Mathayas will discuss the evolution of female education since Vidyasagar. The new national education policy prescribes education in the mother tongue in school up to class 8 and beyond. It reflects Vidyasagar's vision of educating the masses in their own language. The objective of all these missions, National Literacy Mission, Sarva Shiksha Abhijan, Sakhar Bharat, and the new national education policy is to make Indians literate, to remove illiteracy, and this is in accordance with Vidyasagar's desire for mass education. Now we will discuss Vidyasagar's movements for social reform. While Rammohan Rai was a pioneer, Vidyasagar expanded his reforms. One of the first uh, movements which he launched was against child marriage. Now, Let us examine the state of child marriage in contemporary India. Well, the statistics are really shocking. One in two women aged 20 to 24 years in 6 states continue to get married before the legal age of marriage. In this map, you will see that Himachal Pradesh is the has the least incidence of child marriage, just 9.1%, whereas in Bihar it has the highest incidence, 68.2%. According to UNICEF, India has the highest number of child marriages. The greatest number of child marriages, 68.2%, take place in Bihar. It's very surprising, but most offending parents plead no knowledge of the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006. This indicates the need for propaganda. Poverty is the major reason why people give their daughters in marriage at an early age. But from these statistics, it is clear that economic hardship and poverty constitute only a minor, negligible incidence, only 2% of the reasons behind early marriage of women. The need of the hour is to break the tradition, is to make people aware of the not only the illegality of child marriage but also how it harms the girl child. In contemporary India, we find a growing rebellion against child marriage. Thus, children are being induced to protest against child marriage. Children have realized that they have to fight their own battles against being forcibly married off, and they rebelled even at the cost of their lives. Here are some examples from post-slave Bengal. Roshnada Khatun was allegedly set on fire by a stepmother for refusing to marry. Her struggle was finally recognized by the government of West Bengal when she was facilitated on National Girl Child Day. Jomuna Mudi, aged 13, left home on learning that her father planned to marry her off. She also informed her would-be in-laws over telephone that she will not be marrying. Marufa Khatun had to battle nerve disease and her parents' insistence to be married. India has committed to eliminating child marriage by 2030 in accordance with Target 5.3 of Sustainable Development Goals. If we have to meet this goal, then efforts have to be made to combat child marriage on a war footing. Vidyasagar was the first person who raised his voice against child marriage. Prior to Vidyasagar, some common people and elites had tried to give widows in marriage. For example, Rajvallabh Rai of Bikrampur, Dhaka, tried to get his widowed daughter remarried, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Vidyasagar's movement for widow remarriage was inspired by his mother, Bhagavati Devi's exhortations. He staked everything, his scholarship, his financial resources, and his social reputation towards promoting widow marriage. He himself acknowledged that it was his life's work. Here also Vidyasagar took the help of the Shastras to convince people that widow remarriage had scriptural sanction. He cited the Parashar Samhita, which said, Noshte mrite probrojite ক্লীবেচ পতিতে পতৌ পঞ্চসারৎসু নারীণং পতিরন্ন বিধীয়তে. Aurobindo Poddar translates it as follows: on receiving no tidings of a husband, on his demise, on his being found impotent, or his degradation under any of these five calamities, it is canonical for women to take another husband. Finally, Vidyasagar asked his opponents to take a humanitarian view, but the Pandits did not favorably receive Vidyasagar. The British ultimately enacted a law which permitted widow remarriage. It was entitled the Hindu Widow Remarriage Bill, Act 15 of 1856. That is Article 1. Marriage of Hindu widows legalized. No marriage contracted between Hindus shall be invalid, and the issue of no such marriage shall be illegitimate by reason of the woman having previously married or betrothed to another person who was dead at the time of such marriage, any custom and any interpretation of Hindu law notwithstanding. Armed with these provisions, Vidyasagar decided to organize widow marriages. The first widow marriage took place on December 7, 1856 at house number 12 on Sukia Street. 10-year-old Kalimati, a widow, was married to Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay, a colleague of Vidyasagar at Sanskrit College with much pomp and splendor. Vidyasagar himself led the marriage procession and bore most of the expenses. According to Santosh Kumar Adhikari, Vidyasagar incurred an expenditure of 82,000 rupees for 60 marriages. Vidyasagar's campaign for widow marriage created a great stir in society. It was reflected in contemporary literature. Dasarathi Rai refers to the debate. বিধবা বিবাহ কথা কলির প্রধান স্থান কলিকাতা নগরে উঠেছে অতি রব কাটাকাটি হচ্ছে বান ক্রমে দেখেছি বলবান হবার কথা হয়ে উঠেছে সব ক্ষীরপাই নগরে ধাম ধন্য গণ্য গুণধাম ঈশ্বর বিদ্যাসাগর নামক তিনি কর্তা বাঙালির তাতে আবার কোম্পানির হিন্দু কলেজের অধ্যাপক বিবাহ দিতে তরায় হাকিমের রয়েছে রায় আগে কেউ টের পায় নাই সেটা An unknown poet wrote a rhyme in which Vidyasagar's efforts to marry widows were welcome. He wrote in the name in the person of a widow. বেঁচে থাকো বিদ্যাসাগর চিরজীবী হয়ে সদরে করেছ রিপোর্ট বিধবাদের হবে বিয়ে কবে হবে এমন দিন প্রচার হবে এ আইন দেশে দেশে জেলায় জেলায় বেরোবে হুকুম বিধবা রমণীর বিয়ে লেগে যাবে ধুম সধবাদের সঙ্গে যাব বরণ ডালা মাথায় লয়ে আর কেন ভাবিসল সই ঈশ্বর দিয়াছে সই এবারে বুঝি ঈশ্বর ইচ্ছায় প্রতিপ্রাপ্ত হই Did Vidyasagar succeed in his campaign for widow marriage? Critics like Ashok Sen have said that the law remained a dead letter. Vidyasagar was also frustrated by the greed of the people, whom he was financially supporting. K.M. Kapadia, in his Marriage and Family in India, 1955, said even 100 years after the passage of the law, widow marriage is yet to be accepted by society. But a new study on married widows in South Indian villages by Emmanuel Jonagon Johnson and Mrs. Shamola, entitled Widow Remarriage, A New Dimension of Social Change in India, 2012, found that young widows are marrying. 96% of them are Hindus. Widows are no longer alienated from society, but actively participate in social life. All those surveys were educated. They observed that their studies of widow marriage indicated that progressive social change has taken place. But does the same observation applies to widows of North India? These are some pictures of Hindu widows. You can see that all of them are pretty senior citizens. In the present census, that is in 2011 census, we find that 5.6 crore out of 125 crore, 1 crore, that is 4.88% were widows or widowers. Women outnumber men. Uttar Pradesh has the highest number of widowers. Widowhood is higher among elder women. From 2001 to 2011, there has been a 4.6% increase in the number of widows. Varanasi is known as the city of widows. 90,000 widows live there. Many of the widows were married to husbands twice their age, and this indicates the influence of child marriage. After their husband's death, they were either tortured or driven out of their homes by relatives. They faced monumental governmental apathy till 2012, when the Supreme Court took up their case. Now governments have taken some relief measures like building an ashram, but the measures taken are woefully inadequate to meet the needs of widows. Educating widows on their legal right to marry and organizing widow marriages is the best tribute we can pay to Vidyasagar on his 200th birth anniversary year. The third major reform movement which Vidyasagar initiated was against polygamy. In his Bohubiyaho Rohit Uchit Kina Prastab, Vidyasagar stated his arguments against polygamy. Vidyasagar submitted a petition to the government demanding abolition of polygamy in 1855. In his support, he presented a petition signed by 2,500 persons requesting legislative prohibition of polygamy. The Hindu Marriage Act 1955 was passed. It outlawed bigamy. It said that if a wife of a person was living at the time of marriage, the second marriage is null and void. Sections 494 and 495 of the Indian Penal Code will apply. Indians can pay fitting tribute to Vidyasagar only by implementing the social reform measures he advocated. I conclude by citing a tribute to Vidyasagar by the great poet Michael Madhusudan Dotto. He says that Vidyasagar is not only a great scholar but a man with a heart full of compassion and friend of the poor. I quote, বিদ্যার সাগর তুমি বিখ্যাত ভারতে করুণার সিন্ধু তুমি সেই জানে মনে দিন যে দিনের বন্ধু উজ্জ্বল জগতে হেমাদ্রির হেমকান্তি অম্লান কিরণে। Thank you.